Portal 2 is one of the most celebrated video games of all time. Developed and published by Valve in 2011, it was written by Chet Falizek, Jay Pinkerton, and Eric Wolpaw, and directed by Joshua Weyer. Portal 2 was for a long time the top-rated game on all of Steam, and it's not an exaggeration to say it has won numerous awards, like being the Ultimate Game of the Year at the 2011 Golden Joystick Awards. According to Wikipedia, it was nominated for 40 awards across 3 years, and it won 20 of those nominations, including Best Game, Best Multiplayer, Best Performance for Ellen McLean, and Best Performance for Stephen Merchant, and Best Game Design. Its overall quality is the stuff of legends, and if you haven't played the game, you're sorely missing out. What makes the game so good? And did I enjoy it as much on this replay 10 years after I originally played it? Let's find out. Portal 2 has a Metacritic score of 95 with a user score of 9.1, making it the 66th best game of all time according to Metacritic. It has an average playtime of 8.5 hours according to How Long to Beat, but it can be a lot longer if you also count the co-op campaign and the user-made levels. I originally played the game in 2012 and loved it. Both the story and the gameplay is great, and I can't praise the performances from the voice cast enough. I usually play games on the hardest difficulty for these videos, but as Portal 2 is a puzzle game, it has no difficulty settings. It's hard to describe what makes the game so good, but I'll try my best to do it justice, starting with the gameplay. It feels cheap to start off by saying that Portal 2 is a masterpiece, but I feel like not doing so would be dishonest. If you've played the game, you know exactly what I mean, and even if you haven't, you've probably heard what a great game Portal 2 is. The goal of this video essay then isn't to determine whether or not the game is good, it's explaining what makes it so great. And while I love the story and the characters, and again, especially the incredible voice performances, it's Portal 2's mechanics which make it a masterpiece. The mechanics are remarkably simple, but allow for tremendous depth, which is the sign of any great puzzle game. Everything you do in Portal 2 boils down to moving, pressing buttons, placing boxes, and placing portals. That's it. And that's all the game needs. The objective for every puzzle room, and most other puzzles as well, is to exit the room, sometimes with the added complication of having to open a door by either placing a box on a pressure plate or by lining up lasers. When described, the game sounds kind of boring, but it really isn't. The fact that the game relies on standard formulas for building puzzles without it ever feeling rote, and making activities which, when described, sounds practically banal, consistently interesting and varied without actually changing those formulas, is what makes it such a good puzzle game. Puzzle games, more than most other types of games, require consistency. When the rules are changed in a puzzle game from one puzzle to the next, it feels cheap, but Portal never does that. If a test chamber introduces a mechanic, it will always work that way, and exactly that way. There is no randomness in Portal. The jumping pads always take you in the exact same arc, and you will land in the exact same spot. Jumping from a particular height always gives you the exact same velocity. Shooting a light gray wall will always produce a portal, and shooting a dark gray wall will never produce a portal. This consistency doesn't just make transferring knowledge of a mechanic used in one test to another test seamless, it also produces perfect mechanical legibility. The game is almost entirely made up of 5 colors which have specific meanings in the world of Portal. Light and dark gray are the colors of the world, and determines where a portal can and cannot be placed. Orange and blue are the colors of science, as everything associated with aperture is either orange or blue. The portals are orange and blue, the speed and bouncy gels are orange and blue, GLaDOS and Wheatley are orange and blue, and Shell is even wearing an orange jumpsuit with blue details on their other clothes. The final color is red, which is for buttons and lasers. I've spoken about mechanical legibility on the channel before, but for those who haven't heard the term before, it refers to how well the player is able to identify which parts and objects in the game world the player can interact with, and in some instances how. The color coding system in Portal brings incredible mechanical legibility, as you can always tell at a glance which parts are relevant and how you can interact with them. Portal is, in my view, in fact so good at making itself mechanically legible and intuitive that it makes a lot of its puzzles kind of easy. Portal's puzzles are primarily structured like test chambers, where the goal is to make it true to the exit. There are two primary versions of test chambers, those where the actual puzzle is how to reach the exit, and those where the actual puzzle is how to open the exit. In many cases, I personally found it very easy to figure out the solution because it's so quick and easy to identify all the variables. I feel like I might come across as arrogant and braggadocious for saying this, but that's not at all what I mean. My only problem with Portal 2 is that the puzzles are, for me, too easy. I never got stuck on any puzzle, and while it's certainly a good thing in terms of pacing and reducing frustration with the game, it's also kind of my only gripe with it. The core experience a puzzle game tries to deliver is the satisfaction of figuring out the solution to a puzzle. I know this comparison I'm about to make is a cardinal sin in games criticism, but bear with me, please. Puzzle games are a bit like Soulsbornes. Beating a boss or solving a puzzle needs to be difficult, otherwise it doesn't feel like an accomplishment. And just like a Soulsborne game, a puzzle game is all about the satisfaction of overcoming an obstacle. Too many of Portal 2's puzzles were Deacons of the Deep for me, rather than Ornstein and Smaus. Luckily, it didn't feature any Malenias, which is a plus. Alright, enough Soulsborne talk for this video. For those of you who haven't played the series, what I'm meaning to say with the boss references is that too many of the puzzles were too easy. While it didn't feature any wildly too hard puzzle, there weren't enough that really made you think before you actually solved it. I get why there were no difficulty modes for Portal, as having to redesign every puzzle in the game would literally double the work for Valve for implementing just a single other difficulty mode. But I still wish there were a few more difficult tests, even optional ones. Portal 2 could have used some more difficult puzzles to challenge experienced players, but that's, as I said, the only real problem with it. In every other respect, it's incredible. I don't know exactly what Valve's intentions was with the game, but to me it feels like it's supposed to be a natural starting point for not just puzzle games, but video games in general. Its tutorial and level of difficulty is perfect for people with little or no experience in video games. And if you have someone in your life whom you wish to introduce to our wonderful hobby, I strongly suggest recommending Portal 2 as a starting point. It's pretty well known that Valve mainly makes games in order to push either technology or platforms, like how Team Fortress 2 and Counter-Strike are supposed to get you onto the Steam platform where you'll buy other games which make Valve money, and Half-Life Alyx is supposed to sell you a VR headset. And viewed in that light, it seems like Portal 2 is Valve's on-ramp for gaming on PC as a whole. So it makes perfect sense why the game is such a perfect on-ramp for getting people into video gaming as a whole. It's also a great starting point for the series. You really don't have to play the first game to understand the second. Portal 2 is technically a sequel. The 2 in the title is a bit of a hint, but it doesn't require any knowledge of the previous game. To my shame, I haven't played the original, but I was still able to follow the story effortlessly. As mentioned, the game has a very small but incredibly well acted voice cast filled with A-list actors. Ellen McLean plays GLaDOS, Stephen Merchant plays Wheatley, and J.K. Simmons plays Cave Johnson, and even Nolan North makes a brief appearance as the Space Corps. Portal 2 is a comedy game, and with talent like McLean, Merchant, and Simmons, the jokes land really well every time. Obviously, props to writers Chet Falizek, Jay Pinkerton, and Eric Wolpaw for writing such funny material, but I really think that the characters come alive through the voice acting rather than the writing, and given that the game hinges on its characters, it's great that Valve made such excellent casting choices. Alright, so the game is a comedy, and it's funny, but what's it actually about? The basic setup is that player character Chell is probably the last woman on Earth, and wakes up after an extended nap to find that she is still in the Aperture Labs complex. Aperture is a gargantuan underground complex designed to be used in science experiments. The facility is entirely run by robots, and the robot who woke up Chell wants her to help him escape the facility. Wheatley, as the bot is called, is kind of a screw-up.
Let there be light. That's, God. Was quoting God.
And on the way to escape, they accidentally revive GLaDOS, the evil AI which was controlling Aperture in the first game, until Chell killed her.
Sorry about the mess. I've really let the place go since you killed me. By the way, thanks for that.
Sarcasm self-test complete.
Oh good, that's back online.
Now this unlikely duo have to try to escape Aperture Labs with the added problem of the murder-happy science AI. On the way out, we also get some audio logs from Aperture's founder, Cave Johnson.
Those of you who volunteered to be injected with praying mantis DNA, I've got some good news and some bad news. Bad news is we're postponing those tests indefinitely. Good news is we've got a much better test for you. Fighting an army of mantis men. Pick up a rifle and follow the yellow line. You'll know when the test starts.
Even though the game is quite old, I'm not going to talk any spoilers, so as to make sure you get to experience the best gags and plot scenes on your own, or to make you re-download Portal 2 if you've already played it. My favorite part of Portal is the characters. They're so well written and well acted, and works as perfect foils to each other, that they really steal the show. But I think there are two parts of the game setting which are also worth talking about. The first is how the premise, setting, and world design is more akin to horror than traditional comedy. Aperture Labs is mind-bogglingly huge and completely devoid of life in terms of people and fauna. Vistas like this one here are clearly inspired by the horror genre, and the premise of a woman waking up alone in an abandoned megastructure and accidentally waking up a murderous AI who puts her through scientific experiments on the threat of death is hardly a comedic setup. What I find interesting about the horror inspiration is that the game never sounds horror inspired, it just looks horror inspired. Maybe the tonal clash between hearing Cave Johnson rant about burning your house down with lemons in a space which looks taken straight from a horror movie adds to the comedy. Speaking of comedy, all comedies center around people, so it's very brave of Valve to only include a mute protagonist and 3 important characters to deliver humanity and jokes. Of course, it wouldn't make much sense for the setting to have a lot of people running around, but I feel like if Aperture Labs was filled with people, the vibe would instantly change from horror to Monty Python. There's something really absurd about this technological marvel being built for the purposes of scientific testing when it becomes very clear that Aperture's founder Cave Johnson has the most tenuous grasp on what science even is and how one applies to scientific method.
You're not part of the control group, by the way. You get the gel. Last poor son of a gun got blue paint. All joking aside, that did happen. Broke every bone in his legs. Tragic, but informative. Or so I'm told.
I personally think the Cave Johnson sections are the funniest in the game, and that's due to how those sections lean into absurdist humor and 50s pulp tropes, but splitting the player's time across 3 principal characters and highlighting each one's own type of humor is a great structure. British humor really seems to be an inspiration for the game, as Wheatley's backstory, that he is a robot built and designed specifically to generate bad ideas in order to nerf GLaDOS, is straight out of Hitchhiker's Guide. I also want to praise Valve for writing jokes in gameplay like this one in the tutorial.
Do you understand what I'm saying at all? Does any of this make any sense? Just tell me, just say yes. Okay, what you're doing there is jumping. You just jumped, but never mind.
And this one during the daring escape.
The irony is you were almost at the last test. Here it is. Why don't you just do it? Trust me, it's an easier way out than whatever asinine plan your friend came up with.
Oh, what? Come on, how stupid does she think we are? Wait, where are you going? Where are you going?
Oh look, there's a deer. You probably can't see it. Get closer.
I love that I got an achievement for listening to GLaDOS here, and while it does kill me, letting me act on the setup creates a joke between me and the game, where I'm not just listening to the robot say funny voice lines, but I, as the player, actually get to be part of the joke. I've talked about 2 other funny games on the channel, Fahrenheit and Dark Messiah, and neither is designed to be a comedy. Out of the 3, Portal 2 is both the funniest and the best, but I really respect the freeform player-created comedy of Dark Messiah, and letting me fall for Gladys's obvious trap is a more structured form of comedy through gameplay, and something I wish a lot more games did more often. Speaking of things games should do more often, Portal 2 has a lot of user-generated levels which can be played directly from the game itself without having to download or install new levels from a website or the Steam Workshop. It's an amazing feature, and while the user-made levels I played weren't as good as the ones Valve made, holding them to the same standard as Valve's would be unfair. The theme I found in the user-made levels was that they were more difficult to wrap my head around. Many of them weren't actually significantly more difficult, just laid out in a way where it took longer to identify all the variables. It was playing these levels which made me realize what an absolutely magnificent job Valve did when designing the levels in the main game to be so understandable and mechanically legible. I also briefly want to call out that Portal 2 has a great multiplayer mode, and while I didn't replay it for this video, I have really fond memories of playing it with a friend when I originally played Portal 2. The discussion on Portal 2 here on YouTube is, as you would expect, mostly positive. Most people praise the game for being funny and well designed and an overall great puzzle game. IGN specifically said that Portal 2 makes Portal look like the prototype it was and gave it a 9.5 out of 10. GamingBolt says that it surpasses its predecessor in every way and that it's a masterpiece. The Completionist calls it video game comfort food and calls it a masterclass in video game comedy. Even Yahtzee gives it a pretty good review, with his main gripe being that it's following up Portal, which to him was a perfect game. The most critical review I found of Portal 2 on YouTube was Matthewmatosis, who thinks the game tries too hard to be funny, and thinks that Cave Johnson and the old Aperture Labs part is the least funny and most annoying part of the game, partly for being too absurd, and partly from having too much dead travel time rather than actual puzzles. Overall though, people seem very impressed with Portal 2, and from what I could tell, the only people who had negative things to say about Portal 2 specifically framed it in terms of it being different and not living up to Portal 1. I think most people have a positive opinion on Portal 2. After all, at the time of writing, the only game on Steam with a higher user rating is the Portal bundle, which includes both Portal 1 and 2. That makes me a little intimidated about discussing the game, and in some ways the message of this video, in stark contrast to some of my earlier videos, is to wholeheartedly recommend the game. Portal 2 is a classic for a reason, or more accurately, for several reasons. Its unrivaled mechanical legibility, its incredible voice acting, the replayability the co-op and user-generated levels bring. If you haven't played Portal 2, it should be at the top of your to-play list, and if you have played it, replaying it should be at the top of your to-play list. Join me next time as we experience what the Stockholm Tube would be like if it was managed by Västtrafik. Along the way, we'll get caught up in terminally offline political drama, visit Norrland, and discuss Russian literature.